Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We are excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together.
Hello and welcome back to Footnotes. This is Nick Rowland here, and we are continuing our conversation from Saturday night's teaching. So if you haven't listened to the Fellowship Mosaic sermon from this past Saturday night, I encourage you to go back and take a listen, because we talked about Daniel chapters 2 and 7, the visions of the four kingdoms to come, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar and leading up toward the kingdom of God and the coming of the one like a son of man to receive glory and honor and power. And we said that we originally grouped Daniel chapter 8 with these chapters and didn't have time to cover them Saturday night. So I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about what's in Daniel chapter 8. Why did we connect it with Daniel chapters 2 and 7? And it's a pretty cool chapter, and there's a lot going on here, but it fits under this larger theme of the empires of the world and how the empires of the world fit in God's larger plan. So when you read Daniel chapter 8, it follows just soon after the vision that Daniel had in Daniel chapter 7. So in Daniel chapter 7, it's the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, and chapter 8 is the third year of Belshazzar. So Daniel's probably somewhere in his late 60s, early 70s at this point. So he has the vision of the four beasts in Daniel chapter 7. Then 2 years later, he gets the vision that we see in Daniel chapter 8. And I'm gonna pick up. Yeah, we'll start here in verse 2. He says, "In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal." Now, this is significant because at the time that Daniel would have been serving under Belshazzar, Susa was kind of a desolate city. It had really fallen from grace, but it would become a significant city in the Persian Empire that was to come. And so there's a prophetic moment here that Daniel is seeing the city of Susa as an important city again, which is going to happen when the kingdom he is currently a part of, Babylon, is taken over by Persia in the coming years. So we read, he sees himself in Susa, and in verse 3, it says he looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased. So most people see this ram as it's almost universal that this ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire. So you have two groups of people, the Medes and the Persians, who come together to form a single empire. Hence why you have the ram with two horns. And the one horn that grows up longer than the other seems to very clearly be Persia, because after a while, we start off as this partnership between the Medo-Persians, but pretty soon the Persians come to dominate, so that we just talk about the Persian Empire. And so far, this doesn't look that different from what we saw in chapter 7. We have the Persian Empire that's going to rise up, and it's going to take over Babylon. In verse 5, though, he gets a little more information. It says, "As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground." So if we're thinking about empires, we have a ram and a goat. So we have another empire that's going to come after the Persians, coming from the west, and it's going to cover the whole earth without touching the ground. That's an image of speed. He says in verse 7, verse 6, "It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it down to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very large, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, four prominent horns grew up toward the four winds of heaven." This is such a remarkably accurate prophecy about what would happen with the Greek Empire, that people who don't believe in the idea of prophetic speech actually doubt whether it's possible that Daniel could have given this prophecy before it happened, because it's such an accurate description. So Alexander the Great led the conquest of Persia from 334 to 331. Vastly outnumbered, but with incredible military genius, he just sweeps through in 3 years and conquers the Persian Empire. He's in his early 20s at this point. And he has this great power, but he ends up dying at 33. So this would explain verse 8, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. The large horn probably is Alexander. And the point is, like, he's in his early 20s, he's conquering the entire empire, but by 33, he's dead. It's a little bit of a mystery of history exactly how he died, but the best guess seems to be a high fever and alcohol poisoning. After conquering, he and his young friends just started drinking excessively, and he probably drank himself to death. And he had a wife and a son who would have been the natural heirs to his empire, but as the dark powers of the world, these beasts that devour everyone in their path, tend to go, both his wife and son are assassinated after his death. And so he's cut off. But look at what happens at the end of verse 8. It says, after the large horn was broken off, in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. It's exactly what happened. 4 of his generals, instead of finding a single successor to Alexander's empire, the 4 of his generals divide up the empire amongst them. And so they take these kind of 4 corners of the Greek empire, and the 2 that are going to be most significant for the history of Israel are the Seleucus Empire and what we call the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies, who have the kind of region of both Syria and Egypt are their regions, and they're going to have conflict over and over again. But verse 9 is going to be really significant in following. It says, out of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. So this is clearly a reference to Israel when talking about the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people? So we have this description of someone who's going to come out of one of these 4 empires. These 4 dynasties that come from Greece, and is going to stop daily sacrifices, set up this abomination that causes desolation. And pretty clearly, this refers to a ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a Seleucid ruler that came out of Greece that would have been ruling over Israel at this time. And he was extremely powerful, and he was abusive in every way to the Jewish people. And what we read about in the book of Maccabees, the book of Maccabees is a book of Jewish history written in between the time of the Old and the New Testament. And what we read is that Antiochus Epiphanes came in, he went into the Holy of Holies in the temple, the place that they would have kept the Ark of the Covenant, and he took a bunch of the gold and all the stuff out of the temple. He set up a new altar on top of the altar to Yahweh and started offering sacrifices to Jupiter, Olympius, some kind of vague mixture of gods. He didn't destroy the temple, but he profaned it in every way possible. And he made it unclean and incapable of being used for Jewish worship. And this led to something called the Maccabean Revolt. Because everybody was so outraged at what he had done. We read this story in 1 Maccabees 1, 54 to 61. On the 15th day of Kislev, the king had an abomination of desolation built upon the altar. That's the description that we're going to see that phrase come up again and again. And in the outlying towns of Judah, they built illicit altars, and at the doors of the houses and in the squares, they offered illicit sacrifices. Whatever scrolls of the Torah they found, they tore up and burned, and whoever was found with a scroll of the covenant in his possession or showed his love for the Torah, the king's decree put him to death. Through their strength, they acted against the Israelites who were found in the towns each month. As on the 25th day of the month, they would offer sacrifices on the illicit altar, which was upon the temple altar. The women who had had their sons circumcised, they put to death according to the decree, hanging the babes from their mothers' necks and executing also their husbands and the men who had performed the circumcision. This is the intensity of the suffering that the Jews experienced under Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's going to lead to the Maccabean revolt, where Jewish leaders rise up and they drive the Greeks out of Jerusalem, and they take over the temple. And because the temple has been so defiled, they had to go through a cleansing ceremony where they had to, for 8 days, cleanse the temple and prepare it to offer sacrifices again. And there's an incredible story of this process. But at the end of the process of cleansing the temples for 8 days, we read in 1 Maccabees 4, 52-59, Judas and his brothers and the entire assembly of Israel decreed that the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed at their time of the year annually for 8 days, beginning with the 25th of the month of Kislev, with joy and gladness. This is the celebration that we now know as Hanukkah. That's the celebration of when the Jews were able to drive the Greeks out and cleanse the temple from the filth that Antiochus Epiphanes had been brought in. Now, why does this matter for us as New Testament believers? Why is this significant? Well, Antiochus Epiphanes is going to become a legendary evil leader. They're going to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes a lot the way we would talk about Hitler today. Like, the imagery from the Nazis is like the imagery in the West for evil, tyranny, destruction, death, oppression. And this idea of the abomination that causes desolation, what Antiochus Epiphanes did in the 2nd century BC, Jesus is going to pick up and say, that's the sign. That pattern is going to be repeated again. And that's when you know the time of the end is near. And so Daniel chapter 8 gives us the vocabulary that Jesus is going to use, and the book of the Revelation is going to use, to say that the kinds of things Antiochus Epiphanes did to the Jews in the 2nd century, another tyrant is going to do again. So it's almost like saying there's going to be another Hitler. There's going to be another Antiochus Epiphanes that desecrates all that is faithful to the Lord. And that prophecy that comes out of Daniel 8 is going to be significant as a pattern to come in the future under the figure that we will come to know as Antichrist. So that's a little bit of Daniel 8 and what we missed there. Hope that fills out the picture a little bit. But all of this fits under the idea, and the confidence that's supposed to come from this is, even when this stuff is crazy, God is still in control. And even these patterns that are so destructive and so horrible, God is ultimately going to use to bring about his kingdom on earth and his rule. And Antiochus Epiphanes or Hitler or any of these horrendous leaders ultimately will never win, because Christ is king and he is setting up his kingdom on earth. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful week this week, pursuing the Lord, seeking first his kingdom above everything else.